All right. Oh, okay. So thanks everybody for coming to Yulin's defense. So Yulin has been, he's a little bit like Tomas so far in that he's a lifer at MIT, although he's maybe about to break that pattern. But I was just looked up and Yulin showed up. He was actually in 2 of my classes as an undergraduate. And he was also a lab assistant. And then he went off to Google and then came back and has been here as an awesome PhD student since. It's entertaining. I went looking on my computer for an embarrassing photo of Yulin, thinking I would find one from his like senior year of high school and that it would be entertaining to look at. But it's the same photo that he has on his webpage now. So it is entertaining to look at. But so Yulin has been an awesome student to have, and in particular, he has led this kind of independent life outside of our group and done a bunch of things with a bunch of other people, and then kind of came back and stood back and put it all together. And he's going to talk about how it is that we can combine things. Josh was going to say something.
Yeah, cool. This is awesome. So I've also known Yulin since he was an undergrad. He worked in our group on a number of things. Yeah, I'll also cite Tomas. Tomas sometimes likes to say that like the best advice he's given students is when he tells them one thing and they do exactly the opposite. That's fair to say, right? Okay. I don't normally say that, but in Yulin's case, maybe it's true. And that Yulin was always really good, especially I remember when you were starting grad school and saying, okay, well, like, what should I do? What should I do? And I would say, well, I think you should do probabilistic programming or something. He's like, oh, do you really think I should do that? Like, well, I think that's good. Or do you really think I should do, and I would give him some advice and he would often seek my counsel on his research directions or his papers. And then he would kind of not do what I suggested, kind of do the opposite. But he would always take like some nugget. And I felt, oh, that's cool. That's good. And then, and he did, again, amazing things, but working extremely independently of, I think, all the groups that he's been a part of, as well as being a good member of the groups. He's a great team player, as well as a brilliant individual contributor. But when you step back and you look at what he's done, when I look at that, I see like actually the sum is much more, the whole is much more than the sum of the parts, at least of whatever I have contributed. So I'm really proud of that. I mean, I would say, like many people have heard me say, I think for AI, if we want to have AI that really has the power and generality and flexibility of human intelligence, we need to combine a number of great ideas that our field has built up over, many decades. That includes neural or differentiable programs. It includes probabilistic models and inference, and it includes various kinds of symbolic approaches for abstract knowledge representation. And we really need ways of bringing together those 3 great paradigms. And in our group and with our colleagues, we've developed various ways of doing that. That's why I like, in particular, certain kinds of probabilistic programming. But Yulin has developed his own whole toolkit for that. I mean, not alone, but with various collaborators. And looking at his thesis, looking at his body of work, it's a beautiful example of how to bring those 3 big kinds of ideas together to do something that you couldn't do with any one of those tools. And I think that's fantastic. So glad to have played a small part in your research trajectory. Really excited to see what you're going to tell us today and for your next steps.
Great.
Not going too far away. Okay. Awesome.
Okay. Great. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks so much for all the introductions. So today I'll talk a bit about what I've been working on during my PhD thesis. And overall, a lot of my PhD has been driven by this goal where we want to construct these AI agents in the physical world. So we want to get agents. So if we look at current robotic systems, we're only able to do very simple tasks, such as putting a mug on a rack or placing one object on top of another object. But I think the overall goal we want to reach is we really want to get these physical, intelligent embodied agents that can solve all types of tasks in the physical world. You have unseen distributions in unseen environments with other agents. And one big question is, how do we really get these systems that can really generalize to all this huge variety of settings that an agent could see itself in? So in this talk, I'll talk about a general approach towards this problem, and then I'll talk a bit about some key components and results. So the general approach is that we should really learn probabilistic generative models of the world, or like some type of world model. And I'll talk about how these models really allow you to predict and plan adaptively at test time through search. And I'll talk about how you can really build them compositionally so that these models can generalize to areas that you don't really have data in. So first, let me talk a bit about the first point. So let's say we have a simple task such as climb up the stairs, and we want to train a neural network to solve this task. So the neural network takes in input image as well as the task climb up the stairs and outputs an action trajectory. So this is really great when your training and test distributions are the same. But let's say the environment has changed so that this action is no longer valid. Well, now you're a little stuck because your model just outputs a single action. But what we can do is we can instead encode preferences for every single possible action. So this corresponds to learning a probabilistic generative model over all of your actions. So essentially learn a generative model over all possible actions so that the likelihood of the model corresponds to energy value. So when the energy is low, the likelihood is high and the action is good, and vice versa otherwise. And now you can also interpret this energy function as somewhat as a negative utility for each action. So how good is this action or not? And once you have this, now you can do search. So you have this landscape that assigns these scores to every possible action. And now you can run optimization to find an action that really minimizes your overall energy. What this allows you to do is now you can use the search procedure to really adapt to new test time constraints. So for instance, if I want my robot to avoid an obstacle in front of it, or I want to make sure that it preserves its battery life, I can take in the first energy function and I can add it with another energy function that I can construct or learn that specifies whether an action is safe or not. And now I can run the same search procedure to find a prediction that really minimizes its energy, allowing me to adapt my prediction. And so one way to view this prediction paradigm is it's a lot slower than normal predictive models because you don't directly get an answer at once. But this this looser prediction procedure allows you to generalize to new settings by just running this process. So that's the first idea of how learning generative models over all the space of possibilities can allow you to generalize. Let me talk next about the idea of compositionality. So we've all seen that in the last couple of years, large language models are able to do very astonishing things. So if you ask the language model how to construct AI, it can kind of give you these step-by-step instructions. If we look at multimodal language models or language models that have been changed so that they process both visual and language input, they're a lot poorer. And even if you give them a very simple task, such as these two bowls and two cups, and you ask it, is a blue bowl below the red bowl, it actually answers incorrectly. So why is it that we have all of these generative models, they're super powerful and they work so well in language, yet work so poorly in more of these embodied tasks or like even tasks with just images? I think a lot of this has to do with the differences of distributions. So if we look at natural language, I think the real world distribution that we would like to operate over is much closer to the training distribution that you've seen, because natural language itself has been really structured for really concise information communication, and it's naturally compositional so that you've seen many of the combinations that you would want to operate over in the training data. In contrast, if you look at image and text data or data that you might get on an embodied agent, that data is not so naturally compositional, so you often won't see the combinations of language and images that you would like your system to generalize over. So you have this problem where you have a very small amount of training data and you want your system to generalize to a much larger real-world distribution. So what I'll talk about in this thesis is this idea of how energy-based models can really allow you to generalize from the small diagonal training data to the entire real-world distribution. And the overall idea is that you can really compose factors together using this energy interpretation. So you can learn one model to capture one axis of the distribution, and you can train a separate model to capture the second axis of the distribution. And now if we make this assumption that we can independently factorize this training data into these two components, you can now generalize to this entire area of this data distribution, even if you only have real data of this small narrow slice. So in practice, these factors make independent assumptions on the data, which might be biased, but it allows you to generalize to an area where you don't have data for. And these factors don't necessarily have to be completely independent. You can have factors over subsets of variables so that you can still capture correlations between independent axes. But I guess a question that might be that we've seen how as we've increased the size of generative models, they've gotten astonishingly better. So instead of just trying to construct these compositional models, should we instead just try to gather more data to fill in the gaps? Well, it actually turns out that even if we look at generative models in the image setting, they actually haven't gotten as good as we think they have. So if we look at these generative models from 2015 to 2018 to 2022, while the image quality has gotten better, the tasks that they're trained on has also been different. So in 2018, we started training generative models conditioned on class identities, and in 2022, we really conditioned them on text identities. And we've also done all these other things in distributions. In particular, one big thing is we've tried to make these models model simpler and simpler distributions. So while in 2015, we're trying to model this unconditional distribution of all possible images, when we consider the distribution of the images given a class label, it's simpler. And then when you consider the distribution of images given a very complex text description, it's even simpler. So overall, the generative modeling problem has gotten simpler. And another big thing is we've also modified the way in which we generate these samples. So instead of just generating samples from the original distribution, now we switched to generating these samples from this distribution that tries to maximize the difference between a class conditioned distribution and an unconditional distribution. So we've made a lot of modifications in the generation procedure. What this means is actually if we take these hacks out and we just say, well, maybe we just need computational skill to solve these problems, it turns out that these models, even trained with so many resources, end up not doing as well as you would hope they would. So if you simply take a model from 2022 that has been trained on text, very curated text and image pairs, and now you just sample from the original conditional distribution learned by the model, the actual samples look very poor, which indicates that the model hasn't really learned this conditional distribution that well. And now if you actually try to draw samples from the unconditional distribution, so you don't give it a text label, you just sample from the unconditional space learned by the same model, the samples look even worse. So really, while these models have, while the visual results look like they've gotten much better, generative models haven't really become a tool that you can just use with a huge amount of computational power to just to fit any arbitrarily high dimensional distribution, but rather ones that are relatively simple in some sense. And one way to really view this idea of compositional generation is also as a way to really tractably represent these very high dimensional distributions using much simpler ones. So that was just a general approach on how you can use generative models to help you generalize. Now let me talk a bit more about some key components and results in this framework. So first, let me talk, so I'll talk a bit first about the idea of energy-based models. I'll then talk about how we can compose them together, how we can use this for planning, and then how you can combine many multimodal models for intelligent decision-making. But first, let me talk a bit about energy-based models. So energy-based model is essentially a neural network that takes in the input and outputs a single scalar energy. So if you have an energy function for red trucks and you give it an image of a green truck, it assigns it high energy. In contrast, if you give it an image of a red truck, it then predicts low energy. And so you can imagine that this function parameterizes this entire energy landscape over the entire high dimensional space of images, so that all images that are red trucks have low energy and all other images have high energy. So once you have this energy function, you can use this to encode a lot of different functions. So on one hand, you could use it to encode utility, somewhat similar to the example at the beginning of the talk. You could also use it to encode set membership, whether you're inside a set or not. Or more broadly, you can use it to encode any type of probability distribution. So if you have a distribution P of X, you can use the Boltzmann distribution, e to the negative energy, to assign likelihoods to each data point. So once you have this energy function, a question is, how do you actually draw samples from the energy function? So this energy function is defined over very high dimensional spaces. So if you just naively try to find a low energy data point in this high dimensional space, it can be really difficult. So an idea is that, which we'll go back to several times in this talk later, is the idea that you can really use your neural network to help guide your sampling, so it can help you find a low energy data point. And one simple idea is you initialize your guess from Gaussian noise or from some random guess, and now use the gradient of the energy function as a direction to refine the sample to get a lower energy sample or a better sample. But one issue is that the gradient descent procedure only gets you a single deterministic answer. So in 2019, we illustrated how you can more scalably sample from the distribution by using Langevin dynamics. So use a combination of the gradient of the energy function plus some added Gaussian noise to help you draw samples of the energy landscape. So in 2D, it looks something like this. So now the gradient of the energy function attracts you to a single mode, and then the added Gaussian noise over time allows you to transition from one mode to the other mode. So this allows you to more correctly sample from the entire distribution. And on the image space, it looks a bit familiar, but you start with Gaussian noise or uniform noise, and as you run the gradient descent procedure, an image gradually appears. And one way to view this type of generation procedure is that it's much slower than explicitly generating an answer. So if you think of something like a GAN or many other generative models, you can just take in a latent and directly get an image out. So this generation procedure takes many different steps of optimization, but the benefit is that we can construct all these new energy landscapes. So now we can run the same exact procedure to generate. So it trades off the ability to generalize to new distributions with the ability to quickly generate samples. So how do you actually train these energy functions? So I'll briefly talk about how you can train these energy functions using maximum likelihood. Let's say we have a distribution P of X. Then we would likely learn an energy function that represents the log probability distribution. And to train the model through maximum likelihood, you can just use the gradient of maximum likelihood training, which ends up being decreasing the energy of the data point while decreasing the size of the partition function. And if you distribute the gradients a bit, you eventually get this objective where you want to decrease the energy of your real data while you want to increase the energy of all samples drawn from the energy distribution. So you want to increase the energy of all other samples except for your training data. And that corresponds to maximum likelihood training. So the overall expression is you draw some samples from your real data distribution, you decrease the energy of those samples, and then you draw some samples from your model distribution and you increase the energy of those samples. So it's a contrastive loss. Energy-based models have been a very classic type of generative model for many decades. In 2019, we illustrated how you can scale these to very complex high-dimensional settings by using the combination of this Langevin dynamics with an additional replay buffer of past samples to improve the mixing of the MCMC chains. But here's a graphical illustration of this. So at the beginning, you have this flat energy landscape where images of red trucks as well as Gaussian noise get all assigned the same value. And now you have this contrastive procedure. You decrease the energy of real data, so you decrease the energy of red trucks, while increasing the energy of the Gaussian noise. So now you have a better shaped energy landscape, and you can draw a new sample from it. And now this new sample looks a bit more similar to a red truck. So now it's like a red truck was added noise. And you repeat this procedure of decreasing the energy of the red truck while increasing the energy of this drawn negative sample. You can imagine after many, many iterations of the sampling procedure, eventually the only areas that you have low energy are red trucks. So now you're decreasing the energy of red trucks while increasing the energy of red trucks. So at this point, the training converges and you've converged into a ground truth probability distribution. And you can ask also another way that I'll use a lot later on in this talk to train energy-based models is to use diffusion models. So this is the sampling procedure we introduced in 2019. So you have this Gaussian kind of Gaussian noise-like sample, and then as you run these steps of iteration, you eventually get these realistic images. So following our work in 2019, there was work on score-based models, which adopted this Langevin sampling procedure, but where instead of explicitly learning this energy landscape, you learned this denoising network that estimated the gradient of the energy landscape using another objective, denoising score matching. So once you have so you can view a score-based model as simply an energy-based model, but where instead of representing the energy function, you're now representing the gradient of the energy function. And you can view diffusion models as a type of score-based model. So if you actually look at the sampling procedure in diffusion models, you can actually look very, very similar to the energy-based one. So essentially, you can just treat diffusion models as energy-based models, where the denoising network is just the gradient of the energy function. There's a couple added complications in the sense that the diffusion model actually learns a sequence of energy functions as opposed to a single one that I'll talk about a bit later. But it turns out that you can even replace the score function parameterization. So you can replace this epsilon with just an energy function. And then that allows you to compose these models in a couple new additional flexible ways. And in my PhD, I've illustrated how you can use either energy-based models or diffusion models across a wide variety of different settings, such as images, robot plans, text, proteins, videos, and 3D shapes. So that was a really brief introduction on energy-based models. And now let me talk a bit about how you can really compose these models together. Let me build a bit of intuition on this. So when we normally think about trying to get a neural network that has a set of properties, we think about loss functions. So if I want a neural network that generates trajectories that reach a particular goal, and I want to make the neural network generate these trajectories with a particular gate, and we want the neural network to avoid a certain set of obstacles, I can just define a couple loss functions for each of these objectives. And I can train my neural network on all three of these objectives. So if I do that, I now get a neural network that satisfies all the properties I want. The issue, however, is that oftentimes at test time, you want a neural network that can generate predictions with a set of properties that you don't know at training time. So let's say you have a neural network that generates trajectories that reach a particular goal, a neural network that generates trajectories with a particular gate, and a neural network that generates trajectories that avoid obstacles. Now, if you have these three separate independent neural networks, you actually can't combine them easily together because each of the predictions will satisfy one of these constraints, but the combination doesn't actually satisfy all three of them. So one way to view energy-based models is really an intermediate loss compilation of properties that really allows you to compose models together. So now, instead of learning a neural network, for example, for goals that just predicts the trajectory that has a goal, now you have a landscape. So the neural network has low energy at all trajectories that reach the goal and high energy everywhere else, and vice versa for these other two properties. So because now you have these landscapes, you can just combine these landscapes together. And now you run an additional amount of optimization or sampling on these combined landscapes to generate your prediction. So we've essentially not compiled the prediction as much as just explicitly predicting a single trajectory. So we've made predictions slower, but this allows us to now generalize and combine new things together. So let's now look at the image domain. So if I have an energy function for red trucks and I optimize it, I get an image of a red truck. And now I can compose multiple different energy functions together. So I can take an energy function for red trucks and for deserts. And at test time, just composing these models, I can now generate an image of a red truck in a desert. And in practice, these energy functions have a scale. So if you want to control how much of your image you want your image to be a red truck or a desert, you can control the influence of each factor by really scaling the magnitude of the energy function. So it turns out that dependent on what the energy function represents, there's a different algebra in which you can combine these energy functions together. So if your energy function represents utility, similar to the example at the beginning of the talk, then adding the energy functions correspond to utility addition. If instead the energy functions correspond to sets, then adding the two energy functions together correspond to set intersection. And then finally, if the energy functions represent probability distributions, then adding them corresponds to their product. And I will talk a bit more about these operations next. So first, let me talk a bit about this set membership energy function. So imagine we have one energy function for a blue set. So essentially, for all points inside the blue set, the energy is 0 or very low. And for all other points, the energy is very high. And vice versa for an energy function for orange set. Now, if I add these two energy functions together, I get a new energy function that has low energy exactly in all points in the intersection of the two sets. In contrast, if I take the soft men of the two energy functions, now I approximately have an energy function that has low energy in all points in either the first set or the second set. And if I take one energy function and I subtract the second energy function, now I have a new energy function that has low energy in all points in one set while having high energy in all other sets. And if you combine this with a suitable thresholding function, you can now nest these set operations together to construct more complex sets. Oh, yes. Sure, I'm happy to take a quick question. Yeah. So for a lot of our empirical experiments, when we compose these energy functions together, we actually don't do this normalization. But in principle, this would work well if all points in the set had low energy and all other points had high energy, and then you added some type of thresholding function to ensure that energy function is mostly flat. Cool, thanks. So let me give a couple examples of composing these energy set functions together. So we've trained an energy function for generating images of a gray cylinder behind a yellow cube, and we trained another energy function for generating a gray cylinder below a brown cube. And now by composing these two energy functions using the set operation, we can generate an image of a gray cylinder behind a yellow cube and not a gray cylinder below a brown cube. Or we can do something more complicated. So we can generate something, a scene of a gray cylinder behind a yellow cube and a gray cylinder below a brown cube, which are these left two images, or a gray cube behind a brown cube and a gray cube right of a blue sphere, which are the right two images. So you can nest these operations to generate these more and more complex scenes. So on the probability front, so if I have an energy function for a distribution P1 of x, and I have a separate energy function for a distribution P2 of x, by adding these two energy functions together, we can draw samples from the product P1 times P2. In contrast, if I have a distribution P1 of x and P2 of x, and by taking the log sum x of these operations, I can draw samples from the distribution P1 of x plus P2 of x. And finally, if I take a distribution of P1 of x and P2 of x, and I subtract the energy functions, now I can draw distributions from the inversion of two distributions. So I can draw samples from the distribution P1 of x divided by P2 of x. So it turns out that this operation of just composing these probability distributions together has a lot of separate applications. So one thing you can do is you can use this to generate these compositional scenes. So imagine we have a simple text-to-image model that can generate an image of a couch right next to windows. By composing multiple of these models together, I can now generate a complex scene of a couch right next to the windows, a table in front of the couch, and a vase of flowers on top of the table, which is this image. In contrast, if I just directly take this entire description and put it into a single model, the samples don't look as, we don't preserve all the properties of the scene. We can also use a similar operation to really adapt the style of a model. So let's say we have a model that can generate videos in a particular style. By composing it with a separate generative model that specifies the style of digital art or outdoor video, now you can adapt the style of the video to another domain. You can compose these models across different parts of an image. So you can specify that I want a Starship Enterprise here, or I want the sun here, or I want Mars here. So you can specify that objects are at particular locations. And now by composing these models together, you generate a scene with all the objects at all the specified locations. And finally, you can compose these models. If each of these models represent constraints, then by composing each of these models together, you can get a model that solves all the constraints. So you can formulate manipulation problems as constraints and use this composition to solve new manipulation problems. So it turns out one added slight complication as we keep on composing these energy functions is that the more energy functions you can compose, the harder the optimization problem becomes. And it turns out that diffusion models actually provide a way to make this a bit easier. So a diffusion model, instead of learning a single energy landscape, the denoising function at each noise scale learns a separate energy function. So the diffusion model trained on t time steps will learn a total of t separate energy functions. And the sampling is still this Langevin sampling procedure, where there's an added contraction term that's used to transition between one noise level to the next. So now if we wanted to sample from the product distribution P1 of x times P2 of x, so we want to sample from the sum of the two energy functions, naively, you can approximately just take the denoising prediction of the first network and add the denoising prediction of the second model, and then run the Langevin sampling procedure on that. And the overall intuition is by having a set of T landscapes, now you don't have to solve the difficult optimization problem at the last landscape. These intermediate landscapes are much easier to optimize from. There's a small mathematical detail where actually diffusion sampling requires a particular path of the energy functions. So if you actually just add these two gradients of energy functions together and use the diffusion sampling procedure, you actually can't draw proper samples from the composed energy function. But what you can do is you can actually properly sample from composed diffusion models by simply treating them as energy-based models. So now what you do is you treat each of these energy-based models. The diffusion model gets you these t separate denoising functions, which get you t separate energy-based models. And now you can just use annealed importance sampling to draw samples from these t distributions. So you first start a sample from Gaussian noise, and then we run several steps of MCMC, and then you use that sample to transition to the next distribution, and so forth. So roughly what that means is you almost exactly use the normal standard diffusion sampling procedure, but instead of running a reverse sampling step to go from a higher noise level to a lower noise level, you run multiple steps of the reverse sampling step at a particular noise level before moving on to the next one. And this is really drawing MCMC samples from that particular distribution. And importantly, this isn't using the standard diffusion sampling procedure. It's instead using this more annealed MCMC procedure. So that was a lot of complication, but intuitively it looks something like this. So the diffusion model just learns this sequence. So if you wanted to model a complex distribution here, the diffusion model actually learns a set of simpler landscapes earlier. So you can imagine that optimization on these simpler landscapes will then allow you to solve the final problem better. A last complication that I want to talk about is this idea of discovering these composable components. So I've talked a lot about composing components together, but the question is, let's say I have a training distribution that's this diagonal here. How do I actually discover an independent set of factors that represents this distribution? And it turns out that you can discover these components by simply training your generative model with a factorized structure. So if I wanted to represent this distribution P of X, instead of just representing it using a single monolithic model, I can just say, I'll represent this likelihood as a product of n separate distributions. And what this means in terms of the energy diagram I've showed earlier is now, let's say I want to learn a distribution over the reconstruction of an image. So I take the original input image, and now I just parameterize n separate energy functions using latency inferred from this image. And now I enforce that the sum of these energy functions, which is their composition, when I optimize the sum of these energy functions, I get image as I get the original image as a reconstruction. So we simply just train the sum of the energy functions to reconstruct the image. And then this encourages your energy functions to capture independent parts of your data distribution through the principle of information bottleneck. So we make these latent dimensions very low. So the most effective way to capture this reconstruction is to have each of the latents capture independent parts of the input. So empirically, it looks something like this. So if you have an input image or a face, what we find is we infer on the top for the image with 4 objects, we infer individual energy functions that correspond to each individual object. So when we optimize the first energy function, we get the red cube. The second one, we get the small cylinder and so forth. And in contrast, if you look at the bottom image of the faces, when we optimize these 4 energy functions, we get parts of the faces. So we get the facial expression, the skin, the background, and the hair color. And then if we optimize all of these energy functions at once, we get the original reconstructions of the image. The benefit of this is that these components allow us to generalize in interesting ways. So if I train a model on a data set consisting of cubes and spheres, and I train a completely separate model on a data set of boots and trucks, I can take 2 components from the first model. So these components represent these objects. And I can take 2 components from the second model, and I can just jointly optimize the sum of these 4 components. And this allows you to get an image with a mix of boots and trucks, as well as cubes and spheres. So this really allows you to generalize and get these samples that are very different than what you've seen during training. Cool. So I've introduced so in the previous part I introduced the idea of compositionality. Now let me talk a bit about a particular application of compositionality, which allows you to do planning and solve long horizon sequential robotics tasks. So as people, we're able to solve many different tasks with many different tools. So if we want to make a BLT sandwich, we can imagine going outside. We can imagine finding a tomato. We can imagine cutting the tomato, and we can imagine a very long suite of different things that we can do to really make this sandwich. And what we really want is we want to get robots or intelligent agents that can similarly do all types of these tasks in the physical world. I think the biggest bottleneck to this problem is the problem of demonstrations. So it's really hard to get demonstrations of cutting tomatoes in every single house you would want to be in, as well as cutting lettuce in every single house. So there's just a scarcity of data if you really wanted to train an agent just using data to solve all these tasks. So we can actually make this, we can reduce the data requirement necessary to solve these different tasks by using planning or by decomposing these demonstrations into these 2 different factors. So we'll learn one model that captures the dynamics of the environment. So it tells you what are plausible dynamics. And then you'll learn a separate model that learns these are trajectories that accomplish the goal of cutting, or these are trajectories that accomplish the goal of finding tomatoes. And now by learning these two independent models, I can now compose them to cover a much bigger space than I've seen in my demonstrations. Where the intuition is, you can use the dynamics you learned in Kitchen 1, maybe by cutting tomatoes, to solve a new task of maybe finding lettuce or something. So you essentially have, by factorizing these two parts of the information, you can now get a model that can generalize in new ways. Like I said a bit earlier, this actually corresponds to planning, and it's been pretty well studied. So as a recap, model-based planning corresponds to learning-based model-based planning corresponds to you have a starting state, and then you have an action, and you have a neural network that predicts the next state. And what you do is you sequentially roll out and apply this dynamics model multiple times until you get an overall trajectory. So you get a trajectory of states and actions across the sequence. And now you have a separate reward function that really specifies the goals you want to accomplish. And now to do planning, you essentially try to optimize for a set of actions that maximizes the overall rewards across these goals. The issue of this in practice is that oftentimes it's difficult to do this because this optimization actually ends up finding all these actions that get you really, really high reward. But it's not because they actually get you high reward in the world, but rather because there are these adversarial states to your dynamics model and your reward model that make the models believe that you have very high reward. So this idea of learning energy functions allows you to somewhat sidestep this issue. And the idea is that during training time, you're training this energy landscape to have low energy at exactly trajectories that you've seen before in training. So if you optimize this energy function, you won't get these very odd trajectories, that have unrealistic dynamics. So now if you have this trajectory level energy function, if you have a trajectory where there's a state action and state S2 pair that has inconsistent dynamics, the energy would be high. And only if every single state action pair has consistent dynamics is the energy low. Yep. And now there's a small caveat with this energy parameterization. So you've trained this energy function on these trajectories, but imagine we have these trajectories that are blue and we have these trajectories that are gray. Then actually, a trajectory that goes from this black dot to the star in this V shape is a perfectly valid trajectory, but it's precluded from the trajectory level energy parameterization because you assume that all these states are coupled together. So you're missing an independence assumption in the environment. So it turns out that you can kind of solve this issue by just making this energy function compositional. So one way to do it is you just break down this trajectory level energy function into all of these pairwise transition functions. Or alternatively, you can also induce factorization at the architectural level. So you just make the energy function be a set of 1D comms that operate locally. So then you encourage the model to only focus on local details in your dynamics. But we find that this allows you to synthesize these trajectories that are in this shape here. So once you have this energy function for trajectories, now you can use a same composition operation to implement planning. So you take your first trajectory energy function and you compose it with a separate function that specifies a goal, value functions, or test time constraints. And now by optimizing or sampling from this compose model, you get these energy functions that can solve all types of new tasks. So I'll give a couple examples. So first, let's consider reinforcement learning. So we can take this energy function for trajectories on the top, and we can just simply define a separate energy function using a reward function or a learned reward function or maybe even a ground truth reward function. But you take the second energy function that just specifies rewards at every single state, and you take the first energy function, and by just composing these two energy functions and sampling from it, now you get a policy that optimizes or is a policy for optimizing the reward function in this environment. So this allows you to take this dynamics model and use it to solve many different reinforcement learning tasks. What we find is this compositional approach actually ends up working very comparably to the state-of-the-art offline reinforcement learning techniques, where a lot of these methods are very specific. So you learn a Q function or a value function specifically for this particular environment, while our approach just is modular and just requires you to learn a reward function to solve this task. But the benefit of this is that different types of composition allow you to do a lot of different tasks outside of this. So you can take this trajectory level energy function, and you can combine it with a separate energy function that just specifies a start state and goal state. So this is just this is a hand constructed energy function, and essentially, if your trajectory doesn't satisfy the start and goal state constraint, the energy is infinite, and only if it satisfies all of them is energy low. Now, by composing these two energy functions together, you get an energy function that exactly generates trajectories from the start state to goal state, allowing you to construct a zero-shot goal-seeking policy. And here's an illustration of this. So we've trained these models on random trajectories in this environment, and we just specified a black dot and a star. And what we find is that this optimization procedure now allows you to zero-shot construct long horizon plans in this environment, where the environment on the right has a total of 512 steps of planning. And we find that this approach is able to substantially outperform existing offline reinforcement learning techniques because this is a very sparse reward task. So these techniques aren't really able to solve the task. And it can be applied to both single task planning, where you have a particular start state and goal state, or multitask planning, where you have many start states or goal states, because this approach requires no learning for this particular planning operation. And another interesting thing is that if you use the feed-forward network as a dynamics model and you apply some type of shooting to try to reach the goal state, that also doesn't work because the trajectories are very long. And finally, a final thing you can do is you can take this energy function for trajectories and you can compose it with some type of cost function, or some function that specifies the attributes of what you want, where this cost function could be can be order of blocks, it could be hand constructed, it can be learned, and I'll show later it can also be language. What this allows you to do is allows you to take an unconditional model that is able to stack blocks. And it allows you to construct a set of hand constructed energy functions. So you specify that a gray block must be on top of the purple on top of the red, and the red on top of the blue. And by directly optimizing these added cost functions, now you can stack the blocks in a particular order. And in general, this type of planning procedure can be done given only visual observations. So you don't actually you don't need the ground truth state. So if you only have an image observation of the world, you can still learn this energy function to output a set of states and actions. And a particular example of this is diffusion policy, where we just have the energy function over the next sequence of actions. But this enables you to, when given only 50 demonstrations, to be able to plan the sequence of the next actions to execute to do visual motor control on orienting the mug in a particular orientation. And here's another example. So this procedure is pretty robust to disturbances. And then a final thing you can also do is this type of energy function planning procedure also allows you to really plan in the space of languages and video. So what that means is if you want to do planning in states and actions, oftentimes the state space and action space are very different across different environments. And what you can instead do is you can use images to represent many different environments. So now constructing a plan corresponds to synthesizing a sequence of images representing what you want to do in this environment. And now you would have a separate model that infers the actions from these images. And now you can use language, different forms of language, to specify the tasks you want to solve in each environment. So this allows you to learn a single model that can construct these video plans across a wide variety of environments. So you can have this model pick up an object and drop it next to another object. And you can use the same model to also pick up a sponge and spread the board. And note that these are actually generated videos. These aren't real videos. And finally, you can also use the exact same model to pick up a piece of silverware and drop it. So this allows you to have a model solve many different tasks. And another benefit of formulating this type of planning in the space of videos is that it also allows you to learn from videos on the internet. So there are a lot of videos on the internet of how to open door handles. You can imagine that by pre-training your model on these videos, now the model can transfer the knowledge from these videos on the internet to robotic tasks. And another thing, just to give a couple more examples, these video plans are very detailed. So if you have this instruction, put a banana in a pot or a pan. This is a synthesized plan, and you can see that it can really show the visual details of going up, picking up the object, and then dropping it. Or similarly, if you want to have the instruction flip a pot upright in the sink, it really shows all the visual details of actually flipping the pot upright. So it really conveys a lot of information on how you could potentially solve this task. Great. So in the previous section, I talked a bit about how this compositionality can be used in planning. So finally, I talk about how you can really combine these models to across many different multimodal models for intelligent decision making. So if we consider a very long horizon task, such as making a cup of tea, this is a really complicated task and requires many different sources of knowledge. So on one hand, you would need some knowledge of the high level details. So you would need to know like what are the high level steps necessary to make tea, or where I should really look to make the cup of tea. You also need a lot of visual knowledge of the world. So you need to know the you need to know what are different objects. You need to know the 3D geometry so you don't collide with objects. You need to have some physical knowledge. So you need to know how heavy things are. So like whether you can move something around or not. And you also have to have some knowledge of control so you don't drop the objects you pick up, or you can actually grasp the objects that you want to do. As a result, this is especially a demanding problem if you want to learn a single generative model to solve this task, because you would have to train the model on all these variations in semantics, in visual knowledge, in physical knowledge, and control. And because these tasks are so long horizon, it's extremely hard to get data of this form. So it turns out that you can use the same idea of composing energy landscapes to really solve this task in a somewhat zero-shot manner by just taking existing off-the-shelf foundation models, maybe prompting or fine-tuning them a little, and then just composing them together to solve this task. So to do that, let me just briefly introduce a little bit of machinery. So in general, if you want to compose a pre-trained model, you can actually view it as an energy function just via its loss function. So if you have a large language model, you can derive an energy function from this pre-trained large language model by just taking the likelihood loss the model has been trained on. So under this likelihood function, if a language sequence is in distribution, the loss is low, the likelihood is high, and the energy is low. And in a similar way, if you have a model such as CLIP that takes in an image and language and essentially computes the alignment between these two modalities, again, the loss function gives you an energy function. So if you have an image and language pair that is matched, then the loss function is low and energy is low, and vice versa. So this energy function kind of gives you a way to tell whether an input is in distribution locally for a pre-trained model. So let me give an example of why this is useful. Let's say we want to solve a VQA task, a vision question answering task. So we have a question, what is a cat doing? And we have this corresponding image of the cat. Now, if you directly try to use a large language model to solve this problem, it can't solve it by itself because it doesn't see the image. So it can see the question, but it can't see the image. And if you have a CLIP model and you try to use that to solve the task, it also can't solve the task because it can see the image, but it can't actually parse the question. But you can use this machinery of energy composition to solve this problem using these pre-trained models. And the idea is you use the CLIP energy function to encode an energy landscape over possible language instructions given the image, and use the language model energy function to encode an energy landscape over possible language responses given the question. So if you have a response that on one hand is plausible given the language model, given the question, and matches the image given the CLIP model, then you have a response that has solved this VQA tasks. So by just composing these energy functions, you can solve this task. And then there's a small technical detail where if you're optimizing in the text space, you actually cannot directly optimize because there's no gradient that's defined. But we can use the same idea I talked about earlier of using a generative model to really guide your optimization, where you can take one of these energy functions, let's say the large language model energy function, and use it to generate possible outputs. So you just draw samples from the second energy function, which is a language model. So these samples will have low energy under the language model. And then you can simply look for ones that minimize the first energy function also. So here's what it looks like. So initially, the language model might give a response, the cat is catching a mouse. And as you run additional steps of optimization, you gradually get to the correct answer of the cat is walking into your yard. So you can view this operation of energy composition is really a zero-shot way to combine information or communicate between models at test time. So let me go back to the example we talked about earlier, the hypothetical example of making a cup of tea. So we want to construct a plan that is semantically reasonable, that is geometrically plausible, and that is physically executable on a robot. So if we ask a language model how you can make a cup of tea, it could give you these instructions such as look for a tea kettle, heat the water, find a tea bag, which are plausible instructions given this on-horizon goal. But this isn't sufficient because these instructions might not actually be plausible in the environment you're in, and it doesn't tell you how to visually do it. If you take a video model, such as the one I talked about earlier, and you ask it to pour a cup of tea, it can synthesize a video like this. And this video will give you a lot of information about how to pour the cup of tea. But this video model doesn't really tell you the high-level steps necessary to solve the task or the control. And finally, if you have a goal condition policy that takes in the current image observation, as well as maybe the synthesized frames from this video model, well, this model can then instantiate or control the world to satisfy the image goal. So it can actually ground the image goals into continuous control. But the issue is that it doesn't have any of the mid-level or the high-level reasoning that you would want. So we can take this operation of composition and just compose these three models together. And then we can use that as a way to solve this hierarchical planning task. So we want a text plan, an image plan, and an action plan that is highly likely under all three of these models. So that means that the text plan is likely under the language model. So it's a plausible high-level plan given the text goal. Given the text plan and an image, the video model can synthesize a video plan, which means that the text should at least be grounded in the environment. And then finally, the action model, given the synthesized video, should be able to synthesize an action plan, meaning that the video is plausible in the physical world. So if we can get a sequence of text plans, image plans, and action plans that is likely across all three of these models, or essentially minimizes the three energy functions, we can solve this task. And then it turns out that we can use a very similar energy optimization procedure to the one we talked about earlier. So you take the language model, you have it propose a couple actions, you use the video model to select the best one, and that's your best language plan. And then you you take the video model, have it synthesize a couple possible video plans, use the action model to select the best one, and that's your best action plan. So this allows you to get a full sequence of plans for this composition. And here's an illustration of the first part. So if you have a goal, stack a red block on a cyan block and place the red block on the right of the stack, and you have the starting image here. The language model might make a plan, place the cyan block in a brown box. And this is a really reasonable plan, except for the fact that there is no cyan block in the starting image. So now if you try to have the video model generate this video plan, it can't generate anything reasonable, and it gives a score that tells the language model generate something else. And you can repeat this procedure a bunch of times until the language model finally generates something that is plausible in this environment, which is place a white block in a cyan bowl. And in this environment, if you place it in the cyan bowl, it colors the block, and now you have a plausible plan, a plausible language instruction. And in practice, to get these models to like know the domain knowledge in each domain, you would need like a couple of prompts or like a bit of fine tuning. But once you have these three models, by optimizing the composition of all three of these models, you can now zero shots, few shots solve this complex task where you want to stack a red block on top of a brown block and place a yellow block to the left of the stack. And this is just execution. By composing these three models, we're able to put these objects in the specified relation. As the final part of this talk, it turns out that just using the previous consensus procedure, where you just try to optimize each of these parts, it's really slow because the language model will oftentimes propose plans that are not really grounded in vision, and the video likelihood is really hard to optimize. So you can actually use a vision language model to help you accelerate this a little. So instead of having a language model propose different text plans to execute given the language goal, now this vision language model takes in the image of the scene as well as the goal and now proposes these visually grounded plans. So these plans are much more likely to succeed. And then you also use this vision language model to estimate a heuristic function or to estimate how close this plan is to solve the final task. So instead of just using the likelihood, this gives you a more consistent objective to optimize for. So here's an example of this. So now we take an image of the scene and we have the goal, put the fruits in the top drawer. And now the vision language model predicts commands such as place the banana in the top drawer or open the top drawer. So these commands are still not the correct commands to solve this entire planning problem, but at least they are grounded on the objects in the scene. And now you take, once you have this one of these plans, such as place a banana in the top drawer, you input it into video models, and now the video model synthesizes a possible video plan. And if there is no drawer, the video model just drops the banana. And only if there is a drawer, so if you have to open the top drawer, is the video model able to open the drawer. And now when you have this model here, now you can use the same vision language model to take in the video plan, and then go put the fruits in the top drawer, and it can estimate how close this is to solving the task. So if you pick up the banana and drop it, the vision language model will estimate that the progress is low, and only if you actually open the drawer, the vision language model will now estimate the progress to be much higher. So once you have these three models, so you have this optimization problem where you're sampling these sampling plans from your vision language model and video model, and trying to optimize this heuristic function, you can just implement planning. So you can take the image, you can predict 2 text commands, choose the best one, and then repeat the procedure. And this eventually allows you to synthesize this entire long horizon video sequence for actually putting the fruits in the top drawer. And by using particular forms of particular foundation models to capture the vision language model, the video model, and the action model, we can zero-shot solve a long horizon task. So here we have the goal, put the fruits in the top drawer. And by just applying this planning procedure, none of these models have been explicitly trained on this task. We can see that the system is able to put the fruits in the top drawer. And here's another example of a long horizon task. So you have the goal, make these blocks into a line. And this procedure gets these complex text instructions that move the red circle to the left of the yellow hexagon, or move the green circle closer to the red star. And it synthesizes this entire video plan, where this is fully synthesized, but you can see that the system is able to move all of these objects into a line. And you can also convert this to real robot execution. So this is a real robot execution of making a line, where you can see that in the real robot execution, it's not as accurate because the physics of the world aren't as nice as a simulation. And overall, we find that this compositional approach ends up being able to solve these long horizon tasks much better than approaches that just try to learn one giant video model or try to learn like one giant video and language action model. Or like variants of this. So this planning procedure plus composition really allows you to solve these long horizon tasks. Great. So that's the overall talk. And now I'm going to move on to acknowledgements. So I'm really so in terms of acknowledgements, I'm really grateful for like all the huge number of collaborators and my advisors. But let me first start with my advisors. First, I'm really grateful of Leslie. So throughout my PhD, Leslie always told me that I should work on hard problems and I should work on problems that were not very like maybe were not the ones that everyone was working on right now, and that like we should really try to solve like problems very far in the future. So I felt like that was very inspiring, and it really helped me like keep working on things that were not like not really so popular at the moment. And I feel like it really like taught me how to like choose problems to work on and research it overall. And I'm also really thankful for Tomas. So throughout my PhD, Tomas kept on telling me that everything that was done in research had already been done before. And I think Tomas was always Tomas always had a really like broad perspective on the field, and it was really helpful to like just see how like the same ideas seem to keep coming over and over again. And Tomas also kept on telling me that we should get systems that can generalize and be able to solve tasks that you don't have training data for, which was very inspirational. And then I'm also really thankful for Josh. So throughout my PhD, whenever I talk to Josh would always tell me, oh, humans can do all these amazing things. And how can we really get machines that can really solve and be able to solve the tasks that humans can? And I think that was very inspirational in trying to get in like helping me like think about problems or like what are interesting tasks to really try to solve. And I think all three of my advisors also just generally gave me tons of advice on like how to do research, how to like do the entire academic process, and it was just tremendously helpful for all of my advisors. And then I would also really like to thank all my other committee members. So I started working with Philip when I was in undergrad. And I took a class with Philip, Leslie, and Tomas on embodied AI. And I thought that was really inspirational, and it made me like really want to do like a lot of the work in my PhD. And then I would also like to thank Rob. So I also worked with Rob when I was in undergrad. Also, I was working on some protein generative models, and I think throughout I also interned with Rob when I was I also interned with Rob during my PhD, and I feel like I also learned a lot from Rob throughout the years. And I also really so I worked with a huge number of people. I guess especially I worked with I think there are a set of collaborators I worked with especially that I would like to thank. So I worked a lot with Igor and Schwan on a lot of this like energy-based models and compositionality stuff. I had a lot of chats with Jiayan, and we also worked on some reasoning stuff, and I felt like I learned a lot about just classical AI. I worked with Vincent a lot in some of the 3D vision stuff, which I learned a lot. I worked with Anurag on a lot of the compositionality of composing foundation models, and that was I learned a lot from there. I worked with Sherry on a lot of video model things, and then I worked with Anthony on a lot of 3D like neural descriptor fields, robotics manipulation. It was the first set of robot experiments I ran. And I'm really grateful for both of the labs I'm in. So I'm really grateful. I mostly sat in the Learning and Intelligence Systems lab, but I really enjoyed chatting with everyone there. And it was just really fun to be in the group. And I'm also really excited. I was also really happy to be in the computational cognitive science group, and I really enjoyed chatting with some of the folks there. And then so that left, I think, was someone's defense. It was Kaylin's defense. And the right is fall retreat photo for computational cognitive science. And I work with a huge number of other people, and I'm also tremendously grateful of. I just put some people here, but I'm really grateful for the large number of people I got to work with. Yes. And I'm really grateful for my parents. So they were always very supportive across this entire process, the entire PhD process, and it was always really nice to go back home and chat with them, and that was really nice. And finally, I'm also very grateful for my girlfriend. I guess we got lots of food, and it was very very relaxing way to go through the PhD. Okay. Again, thanks so much for everyone for coming. And yeah, I'm really grateful for everyone for coming here. Yeah.
We have our professor back. We can have some questions from the audience. No.